This video tells the true stories of a few Europeans who came to America and chose not to stay silent in the face of injustice against native people. One was Bartolomé de las Casas in Spanish, priest who spoke out against the mass killings and pleaded with the King of Spain to protect the indigenous. Another was William Penn, one of the few settlers who bought land from native tribes instead of stealing it. The third was Chief Justice John Marshall, who ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation's land rights, though the government refused to enforce his decision. They couldn't save everyone, but they didn't stay silent. This is the real history of those who tried to stand for justice, even when they stood alone. 1. Bartolomé de las Casas, the priest who tried to defend the natives. In the early 1500s, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish priest, arrived in the Americas. At first, he was a landowner who used indigenous people as forced labor. But after witnessing the brutal treatment and mass killings committed by the Spanish conquistadors, especially during the conquest of Mexico, he changed his views completely. In 1514, he publicly renounced his past and declared that enslaving native people was a grave sin. He returned to Spain to speak directly to the king and pleaded for better treatment of the indigenous populations. He said they are human. They feel pain. They have souls. They are not beasts. Las Casas wrote a book called A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, where he described how Spanish soldiers speared indigenous babies, burned women alive, cut off men's hands, and let their dogs tear people apart. These were not stories. They were real events he had seen or collected from eyewitnesses. Thanks to his efforts, the Spanish crown passed laws aimed at protecting native people. However, these laws were rarely enforced in the colonies. Most Spanish officials ignored them. Still, Las Casas was one of the first Europeans to defend the rights of indigenous people in writing, using facts rather than emotion. He didn't save millions, but he left a record that history could not erase. 2. William Penn, a colonist who bought land instead of stealing it. In 1681, an Englishman named William Penn came to what is now Pennsylvania. He was part of the Quakers, a Christian group that opposed violence and promoted equality. Unlike most colonists, Penn did not take land by force. He believed in fairness and peace. He met with leaders of the Lenape tribe and said, "We want to live here, but only if we can buy the land from you. We come in peace." After several meetings, both sides agreed on fair terms. Penn honored the agreement. For years, Pennsylvania had no major conflict between settlers and indigenous tribes, and a rare example in colonial America. Penn left instructions to his children: treat native people with justice. But his descendants broke that promise. In 1737, they forged a document called the Walking Purchase, claiming that Penn had the right to as much land as a man could walk in a day and a half. They hired fast runners to cover a massive area and tricked the Lenape out of thousands of acres. The tribe was betrayed by a lie. William Penn had good intentions and built trust, but his legacy was undone by those who came after. Even the kindest individuals could not stop the machinery of colonization. 3. John Marshall, a judge who tried to save Cherokee land through law. In 1830, the U.S. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, allowing the federal government to force native tribes off their lands. One of the most affected tribes was the Cherokee, whose territory lay in Georgia. The state began seizing their land illegally. Instead of fighting back violently, the Cherokee took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1832, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled in Worcester, for Georgia, that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct political community. He said Georgia had no right to impose its laws on Cherokee land. It was a rare legal victory for a native tribe. But President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the ruling. He reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." With that, he made it clear that law meant nothing if the government didn't care to follow it. Later that same year, the Cherokee were forcibly removed from their homeland. Around 15,000 people were marched westward. At least 4,000 died from hunger, cold, and disease. This forced relocation became known as the Trail of Tears. John Marshall had tried to uphold justice. His ruling remains a powerful moment in American legal history. But even a Supreme Court decision couldn't protect native lives when power ignored the law. Conclusion. These stories show that not all Europeans who came to the Americas were cruel. Some saw the suffering of indigenous people and tried to help. Bartolomé de las Casas used his voice to tell the truth. William Penn sought peace and fairness. John Marshall tried to use law to defend the innocent. But each of them stood against a system much bigger than themselves, a system built on greed, conquest, and destruction. Their efforts could not stop the tide. They could only shine a small light in a very dark time. Still, their actions mattered. Because of them, history remembers that not everyone stayed silent. They remind us that justice, even if ignored, must still be spoken.